please welcome Vivint President Alex Dunn, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney.
I think we're going to go over here.
Hi.
Thank you so much.
How you doing?
Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Wow. Wow. That's a big crowd. Wow. Hey, guys.
There's a lot of people here.
Yeah. They must have heard you were coming, Alex.
No, I would have emptied the place, but all right, let's start with a hypothetical here.
Yeah.
Hypothetically, let's just assume or pretend that a lot of people are waiting to hear you make some kind of announcement. Hypothetically, would you be making that announcement in the next 30 minutes?
You know enough about politics to know that you would never make a critical announcement on the day when the the week that the Mormon Church just names the new president, when it's a Friday, and of course you only put out bad news on Fridays, and number three, when someone lights a gasoline truck on fire on I-15. So no, there'll be no announcements today, Alex.
Okay. So we've gotten that out of the way. So I was looking, doing a little research, getting ready for this, and I was interested to see how big Bain Capital has gotten. So went and saw that Bain Capital currently has about $85 billion of assets under management. How big was your first fund that you raised when you started Bain Capital?
We went out to raise a fund in 1984. There were two of us that hit the road and went to a number of institutions and wealthy individuals, and after a full year of fundraising, we came up with $37 million. That was the first fund. And that fund did very well. The next fund ended up being almost $200 million. But that first fund of 37 was probably our best. We had a number of good investments in that. But people would ask us how successful we were in our personal investments, and we had to tell them the truth. Not very successful. And they said, well, why are you going to be successful in doing what you're doing? And we said, well, we have a very different vision. We think we can do something very different than anybody else that's in the venture capital and private equity space. And we convinced a few people, a few individuals, that was the case, and that's how we got going.
Awesome. So when you started back with that $37 million fund, did you have any idea that Bain Capital was going to be as successful and as big as it's gotten today?
No, it's kind of embarrassing to say this, but we studied the venture capital and private equity. Back then it was called the LBO, or leveraged buyout business. We studied that and concluded that it had really peaked. And this was 1984, and that beyond that it was probably going to have some rough times. Of course, the stock market was what, 1,000 or 2,000, and now it's 25,000, 26,000.
Yeah.
So we were completely wrong about the timing. We never would have imagined that it would grow to the extent it has. But our vision was that we would have a good time, we'd do well for our investors, we put their interests first, and that we would only invest in settings where we thought we could see something or add something to the investment that everybody else didn't see. If what we saw was the same as everybody else was seeing, then we really shouldn't be investing. And only if we saw something, we used to say if there was the hair, on the deal, or we could find some spin on the ball somehow, that's when we'd get involved.
So if you didn't see back then that it was going to be what it is today, what things did you do back then that you think laid the foundation to allow it to become what it is today?
Well, the co-founder and I, a guy named Coleman Andrews, recognized that we were not the smartest people in the room. We were at that time associated with a large consulting firm called Bain & Company. We knew their competitors, McKinsey and BCG. I'd actually worked at BCG, and I knew there were a lot of smart people out there, smarter than me. And if we wanted to be the most successful and the most effective we could be, we should hire people smarter than us. So number one was we went out after really smart people, or people who had skills that we thought were particularly adept at dealing with the kind of marketplace we were looking at. Number two, we decided very early on we would not spend a lot of time worrying about people's flat spots. Everybody has flat sides, some part of their total package that just isn't ideal for the marketplace or for the challenge that you have. But if you spent your time working on people's weaknesses, you'd end up working all the time on weaknesses. We said instead, what we're going to do is we're going to find people that are extraordinary in one way or another, and then make up for their weaknesses with other members of the team. So we had some folks that were really great at finding deals, but were lousy at evaluating them. Others that were extraordinary analysts, but really couldn't go out and make friends and find opportunities. One guy that was an extraordinary structurer. He knew how to put together all the financing and all the documents. And so we built a team that was so much better than any one of us could have been. And of course, collectively, a lot smarter than either Coleman, Andrews, or I. And I think that's part of what made us as successful as we were.
Oh, that's really, really good advice. So you've probably heard hundreds, probably thousands of pitches by company founders, entrepreneurs, business people over the course of your career. What advice would you have to an entrepreneur who's just getting started and needs to pitch his business, either for financing or for other purposes, that would allow them to be a little more successful than maybe they would be on their first time?
This is probably going to surprise you a bit. But what we looked at first as we considered an entrepreneur to back, and that could be an entrepreneur in an existing company, an individual who had a vision for making it better, or it could be an entrepreneur in a brand new enterprise. The single most important element was not the business plan or the financing or the wisdom and the power of their idea, but it was the capability of the person bringing that idea, the person who would lead the enterprise. And we looked to see whether people around that individual respected and admired them. Did they have friends? Did they have colleagues in the professional world that admired them? Because I happen to have found that the most successful senior executives I've met are people who other people admire and respect and trust and follow. And so that was first. And oftentimes, by the way, you could see that by their prior track record, but sometimes their track record wasn't great. So Tom Stemberg, who came to us with the idea for Staples, the office superstore, I called his prior boss, who was at First National grocery stores, and I said, what can you tell me about Tom Stemberg? He said, well, he's brilliant and everybody loves him, but we fired him. And I said, why'd you fire him? He said, well, he made this terrible mistake in our fresh food department, and it cost us a lot of money, and we had to let him go. But people really respected and admired Tom Stemberg, and that's what we wanted to hear. Now, of course, so for us, that was number one, the quality of the character of the person that would be leading the enterprise. And then number two, I think, was the vision of the business plan, which is there something here that is truly compelling, that says this is not just a product. There are a lot of people that came to us with ideas that you look at it and say, this is a great product, but you ought to go license it to someone or sell it to someone, but it's not a company. You haven't got a corporation here. And then there were others that had a business plan that said, this is not just the first product, this is going to create an industry or create a business that will go on to change an entire sector of the economy.
So you started your career at Bain Consulting, or you were there early in your career. You then went on to start Bain Capital. But after you had done that, Bain Consulting got into some trouble and actually was if it wasn't bankrupt, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. And you were asked to come back and turn around Bain Consulting. What did you do to, obviously we know now that Bain Consulting is certainly one of the premier names in consulting in the US, so we know you were successful in getting that turned around. What did you do to turn it around, and what lessons did you learn? What was maybe a little different in a turnaround than in building something ground up?
Yeah. Actually, we had been fortunate, Alex, that in our work in the private equity world, we had invested in some businesses that were in real tough shape. So we bought a company called Vetco Gray, for instance. We bought it, it was from Houston, Texas. It made subsea wellheads. In the year before we bought it, it lost $72 million. The chief executive officer of the parent company said, we would sell Vetco Gray to anybody for $1. And so we showed up and said, we're here with our dollar, we want to buy it. He laughed and said, well, that was just a figure of speech.
Did you pay it in quarters? Or?
Yeah. They actually went out and hired an investment bank to auction the company. And Baker Hughes was the parent company. They auctioned it around the country. No one wanted it because it had a lot of debt. You weren't just paying the dollar for the equity, you had to assume a lot of debt.
Probably a bad strategy to tell people you'd sell it for $1 and then put it up for auction.
Yeah, you're probably not going to optimize your selling price. But we ended up buying it for virtually nothing, I think $1. And so we had learned in that experience and others like it to sort of follow a formula. Number one, when we got in a tough situation, was to do what we called a strategic audit. Now that's not, the CPAs coming in. It meant let's take apart the entire enterprise and see what's the quality of our people, our human resources, how do we stack up against our competitors, what do our customers think about us, how is our R&D relative to the other people, and of course our financials. What does our financial footing look like? Does it match our growth needs and so forth? So the first thing was to be entirely brutally honest about where we stood. So when we came into Bain & Company, the first thing we did, the Bain Consulting side, the first thing we did was, okay, let's take a look at what the setting is and take apart the financials. And we recognized right away we weren't going to be able to make payroll in 10 days or 2 weeks. That's how bad it was. So step one, with that being the case, with that brutal, honest recognition, we called our landlord. And we said, we have good news and bad news. The good news is we always intend on paying you our rent. The bad news is the check that you are about to receive in the mail, we put a stop payment on it because we can't afford to pay you. And this was over $1 million for the lease on our property in Boston. And they weren't happy. We didn't pay them for 2 years. But that was essential to understand what our needs were financially. But the strategic audit also told us that instead of firing a lot of the senior people, which is what the company had planned to do, we said, you don't want to fire the sales force, in effect. The senior people are the ones that get new clients. So we can't afford to fire people. We have to keep all these senior people. As a matter of fact, this is so critical to us that I'm going to go to them as the new CEO of this difficult setting, and I'm going to ask each of them to make a commitment that they'll stay for at least 1 year. They won't go anywhere else. Because we had 1,000 people at that point whose lives depended upon the success of this enterprise. So I needed that team to stay in place. That was part one is strategic audit. Number two is build the right team for the needs that you identify.
How many people did you actually get to commit to the year?
Every single one. Every single partner. At that time, there were probably 50 or so partners of the firm. They all committed. There was one who was not the right fit, that we did not ask that, but all that we asked signed a statement, literally signed a statement saying they would stay with the enterprise.
What were you telling them in those meetings that it couldn't have been good news? So how did you get them to do that?
Well, number one was audit. Number two was get the right team. Number three is focus, focus, focus. And we said, okay, here's how we're going to be successful. This is how we're going to change the product offering we have. This is how we're going to change our compensation system to reward people not just for doing good analysis, but for going out and finding new clients and selling our new vision. And they bought into that. I think they also recognized that if they didn't, that the whole enterprise was going to go down, and that 1,000 people would lose their jobs in what would be very difficult economic circumstances. Now, obviously, some of the partners that were the least performing of the partners, they'd probably sign on to anything. But some of the best performers could have been hired almost anywhere immediately for probably more money. But the collective sense of, hey, there's a purpose here and a mission greater than just how much money I can make this year allowed us to be successful. So those three things, audit, team, and then a focused vision.
It's really, really good advice. So you've had a lot of success. I think especially people that are maybe newer or younger in their careers, just starting out. I think, look at people like you and say, wow, it's amazing what you've done. You can list out all the accomplishments. Have you ever been truly scared of failing along the way? And if you have, how did you kind of work through or overcome that fear of failing, or perhaps failing to have the success you did?
You all may not know this, but I actually ran for president and lost. So the fear of
I
failing.
was talking about business, not politics.
The fear of failing was actually realized.
Yeah, yeah.
I love what Walter Mondale said. He had the misfortune of running against Ronald Reagan, and of course losing famously. And he is reported to have said that all his life he wanted to run for president in the worst way, and that's just what he did. And Alex, each time I began a new enterprise, when I left the home and comfort of a successful consulting firm, Bain Company, to go with another guy and form Bain Capital, we were afraid we'd lose people's money. I mean, I was terrified, and I was probably too conservative. In the 15 years I was at Bain Capital, our compound annual growth rate for our investors, this is before fees and carry, but the gross growth rate was 113%. So that says I was a bit too conservative. I should have done more deals. But I was afraid that we would be not successful, and that we would lose people's money, and they'd be very, very harmed by that. Likewise, when I was asked to come out here and take the reins of the Olympics, I was very, very concerned that we would let down the people of Utah, the people of the country, the athletes that counted on coming to the games here and performing here where they'd been training for years. I was very concerned about that. When I became governor of Massachusetts, you were there, we projected that we were going to have about a $500 million shortfall in our budget. When we got in, it turned out to be, as I recall, $2 billion shortfall. Yep. And I had promised I wasn't going to raise taxes or cut vital services. How was I going to do it? So in each of these cases, if you're not afraid, I mean, if you go into an enterprise and you're not worried, then you're not being bold enough. I mean, you've got to have a vision that says, I'm going to do extraordinary things, and I may not get there, but I'm going to try. I mean, I aspired, and though I achieved not, I was satisfied. And that phrase has been one that my father described pretty much throughout his life. And the only answer I have for a setting like that is it's thrilling. It's thrilling to be in a setting where you know you could fail or fall. But it's also part of life. It's exciting. It's life in the fullest sense. So you dig in, give it your full potential, your full energy, and if things come together. And by the way, there's a lot of serendipity. The idea that somehow that you can take on any challenge and you're always going to be successful. No, that's not the case. Some things happen that just you didn't plan on, and you fail. But failure's not the end. Failure's part of life. You learn from it and move on.
Yeah. Those are really, really great lessons. Let's talk a little bit about your dad. So people may or may not know, probably most people know, but your dad was a very successful person as well. He was CEO of AMC Corporation. He was governor of Michigan. He served as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under Nixon. And I know that you really looked up to him. I think everybody that knew him looked up to him. What are maybe a lesson or two that you learned from him that the people here today would be interested in?
Well, first was don't just muddle along. Have a vision for where you want to go. So he came into an automobile company, which the audience won't remember because it's now gone, but it got purchased by Chrysler Corporation. But he made something called Ramblers, Nashes, Hudsons, and Jeeps. That's what American Motors made when it got sold to Chrysler. He came in at a critical time for the company. The chief executive passed away unexpectedly. He was a vice president, a new vice president at the company, and was made the new top dog. And his vision was that he was going to change the company from one that competed with Chevrolet and Ford, which dominated at that point the auto industry, to make not the most expensive car or the fastest car or the coolest car, but if you will, everybody's second car. We called it the grocery getter, the station wagon, the car that mom or dad would take to the grocery store on the weekend to pick up the groceries or take the kids to the soccer game. And he would make the most reliable, most fuel efficient, and safest automobile you could possibly have. So when everybody else was making bigger and bigger cars with bigger and bigger engines and huge tail fins, he went and said, let's reintroduce a car that we made, excuse me, that we made several years ago that was smaller. Let's introduce that same car, call it a Rambler, and put it on the market again. And we're going to change the whole direction of this company. So number one was a clear vision for where he wanted to go with the company. And then number two, I mentioned it before, be bold. Believe in yourself, give it all of your energy and passion. And he sold our house. He took the money from the sale of the house and bought stock in his company. It had dropped from about, I think, $30 a share under the prior president. It dropped to about $7 a share. He took the money from the house and bought stock. He'd given us savings bonds every birthday and Christmas, I think $50 or $100 savings bonds. He sold our savings bonds and bought stock in the company. Now, a year or two later.
Did you know that he did that?
No, I was a kid. I had no idea. A year or two later, the stock went from $7 to over $90 a share. And American Motors, in this Rambler, for a while there, became the number 3 selling automobile in America. So now it doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you fail, as I said. But having a clear vision and not muddling along, and then being willing to be bold and aggressive in pursuing that vision is something which I learned from Dad.
Those are really awesome. I know, as you know, I know your sons very well, and I would be really proud to have any of my kids end up as well as your sons have turned out. How, given everything that you were doing and how busy you were and starting companies and running the Olympics, how did you and Ann raise such a great family?
I don't know that I have any great insight in that regard. I'll mention a couple of things. And part of this just comes sort of naturally. It maybe flowed back to when I was going to school. I was going to law school, and I figured that because I was coming from BYU and I was now at Harvard, that I was going to flunk out. This, again, a fear of failure. And so I was studying all the time, just scared to death I was going to be kicked out of the class. And there was always this cloud hanging over me, this sense that if I'm not studying, that I'm getting further and further behind. The other kids are studying, and I never was able to relax. I was always sort of fearful and feeling this darkness around me. And one day I said, I'm actually going to live the law of the Sabbath. I'm going to take Sunday off, and I'm going to devote Sunday to my family and my church, and I'm not going to study on Sunday. And that way, what I found was it freed me of this dark cloud. On Sunday, it's like, I know I don't study on Sunday, so it's all family and fun and church and things I enjoy, and it just lifted my life, and it allowed me to really concentrate on the times when I was studying. That was part one, and that led to something when I got into my second job. My first job at Boston Consulting Group, I just worked like around the clock, and when I moved to go to Bain and Company, which was a couple of years after my first job, I went to Bill Bain, and I said, Bill, I'd really like to join you, and I appreciate your offer, but there are a couple things I got to tell you. One is I don't work Sunday. If there's a crisis, of course, I'll jump in like anybody else. But under normal circumstances, I can't work Sunday. And at the end of the day, I'm going to go home, and I'm going to spend time with my family. And he said, that's fine. At the end of every day, when I got home, even though I carried a briefcase, I don't recall almost any occasion when I ever opened my briefcase. I came home and spent my time with Ann and the kids. And we enjoyed dinner together. Usually it was the kids had eaten first. I came back and they joined me for a little late dinner. But we watched TV or we read books. We had fun times together. I devoted the time I had either to my church, to my family or to my work entirely focused on that. So when I was traveling, for instance, in an airplane or in a hotel room, I worked. I didn't watch TV in my hotel. I worked every minute when I was away from home. But when I was home, totally, completely focused on the family.
Wow, that's great. So, Anne has MS and has had for a long time now. And what have you and Anne learned in her battle with MS?
Well, I begin with the first experience we had. Our life had seemed almost, like a honeymoon life up until the point when she began to have numbness in her leg, and it got worse and worse and spread up into her side. And we went to a neurologist. He did all these tests and took spinal fluid out. And we were sitting in his office waiting for the diagnosis. And there were all these brochures on the table in the waiting room in his office. And I picked up the brochures, and one was for ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease, and there were other diseases. And I looked at Lou Gehrig's. I knew that was fatal. And I said to Anne, I don't care what it is. We can handle anything as long as it's not fatal. And sweetheart, we can do this together as long as it's not fatal. And so when she was diagnosed with MS, we both hugged each other and cried in sadness, but also in happiness that it wasn't something that would take us apart so early in our marriage. We have found in the service that we've both had in our community, as well as in the disease that she has, that almost everybody at one time or another in their life will have a bag of rocks that they're carrying that you don't see. You see people at church or on the street or in the office, and they're smiling, and you think, oh, their life is all so easy. And then as you get to know them, you realize they've got some great burden they're carrying that they don't tell you about. They don't wear it on their sleeve. They're carrying it behind them. And it might be a disease. It might be a child that has severe disabilities of some kind. It might be a loved one. It might be a divorce, a loved one that's being estranged, a divorce that's breaking up a wonderful, hopeful marriage. But people, virtually everybody you meet has some kind of burden. And that makes you a great deal more empathetic to other people and a great deal more forgiving of other people. When people are rude or cut you off or are angry or short with you, sometimes you realize they may have had something that has made their day or their week or their month or their year particularly difficult. I mean, the life experience that we enjoy has challenges. It's kind of meant to have those kind of challenges. And Anne's MS has been one of those things. We battle through it, but I have to tell you, every day, I thank my Heavenly Father that she's still here and that she's as well as can be, and I feel like a blessed person.
That's great.
I tried that once, thank you. Twice.
I agree. As governor in Massachusetts, and being a Republican in Massachusetts, and this is a period of time that I got to work with you, for you. You're in the heavy minority there. And what did you learn about getting stuff done as a Republican governor in Massachusetts?
Well, and you remember this, Alex, but the folks in the audience may not. My state was overwhelmingly Democrat at the state level and at the federal level, actually, our delegation as well. About 87% of the House and Senate were Democrats. And that means, of course, that my veto wasn't worth spit. I mean, I could veto something, and in a voice vote, they would just override it. And so it was not lost on me that for me to get anything done, I had to be able to work with the leadership in the Democratic Party. And so as we began, my chief of staff, Beth Myers, said, let's have you go around and meet with all the committee chairmen of all the Senate and House committees. Have you meet with the leadership in their offices. Don't call them to the governor's office. like you're this big, high and mighty person. You're not a big, high and mighty person. I mean, you have no power at all, all right? They're the power. And so I went to their offices and asked them what they were working on and said, how can we work together? And I'll never forget meeting with Bob Travellini, the Senate president. I went in his office, which, by the way, is much more elaborate and beautiful than the governor's office. And he said this, he said, the campaign is over. The people expect us to do the people's business. And I thought, boy, that is just the right kind of attitude that I had hoped to find. And so we ended up working together. We would have a meeting, as you recall, every Monday for 1 or 2 hours. The Senate president, the Speaker of the House, both Democrats, and myself, and maybe a couple of other invited people would come together. We'd rotate offices. It wasn't always in my office. We'd go to their offices. And then we'd talk about what was happening in the state, what things we needed to do. None of that ever leaked out. I don't recall us in 4 years, every week having a meeting like that. Not a word leaked out. At one occasion, I remember one of the two of them said to me, we had a bill that came up before the legislature. There was a very pro-union bill that we all agreed would not be good for business and might cause jobs to leave our state. But it was very popular among the unions, and the Democratic Party got a lot of support then in my state from the unions. And one of those two men, I won't mention which one, I don't want to put him on the hot seat, but they said to me, Governor, you got to fight this harder. You need to give us more cover on this, because they didn't want it to pass, but they had to be for it. So they wanted me to fight harder against it to make sure it didn't pass. And that's how we were able to work together. We would get together occasionally with our wives for a dinner in the North End where spaghetti and other Italian delicacies were available, just on a social basis. And when I was fighting for the health care plan I wanted in Massachusetts, I met a lot of resistance from both these guys. And I wrote out a letter as to what I thought needed to be done. I went to their homes, knocked on the door on a Saturday, and delivered it to them and spoke to them at the door to show how important this was and who was the power. I mean, look, if you want to get something done, you have to recognize that not everybody agrees with you, that the country is made up of Republicans and Democrats, and some kind of in between is independents. And you've got to find ways to see if you can't get common ground. And I was able to do that in part by the necessity created. And I think, by the way, that President Obama had the misfortune of having a supermajority in the House and Senate when he got elected for his first 2 years, so he could do anything and didn't realize how important it was to respect and work with and collaborate with Republicans. And so in his last 6 years, he couldn't get much done. I was lucky. It's funny to hear that, but I remember talking to Governor Levitt. He said, you know, having an opposition party is not necessarily a bad thing for getting things done, and I agree.
Yeah, that's really good. So there's some anxiety, I think, in the world today about the future and what the future holds in our state and in the nation and in the world. Do you have any thoughts about what you think the future holds for us?
That's a big topic. Let me connect a few things. One, I think our economy is going to do well, continue to do well. We will probably have a recession at some point. I don't know when. I mean, Alan Greenspan in his book says, look, recessions are the result of irrational behavior, and it's hard to predict irrational behavior. It's an overreaction to something. So at some point there will be some event which will cause a spiral and a recession. I don't know when it'll happen. It's conceivable it won't happen for years and years. But I happen to think that the elements are in place for us to have a continuing, growing economy, lower unemployment, and finally to see some real growth in wages and salaries. I think you're going to see that. I think the tax plan that was passed by a Republican administration and Washington is good for starting enterprises, starting businesses and growing businesses and keeping them here. And by the way, one of the great failings that I have and that my party has is we talk about business and business formation without making the connection as to why we care so deeply about that. We care about business and business formation and business growth, not so that wealthy people can make more money. No, the wealthy people are doing fine. What we care about is how do you get wages up for the average American. And the only way I know to get real wages up is to have more businesses and more growth, so people have to compete to hire people. And as they compete to hire people, they have to raise their wages to get them, and that gets wages up. That's why we're fighting for better conditions for enterprise. So I see those conditions. I see those conditions at play. By the way, the world economy is doing well. Every region of the world is doing well. Even Japan seems to be a little better. China has seen the best growth, I think, in 7 years or so. So it's looking pretty encouraging. So I think the economy looks good for the intermediate future. Globally, we face some real challenges. Russia continues to be a geopolitical competitor, adversary. They basically back the world's worst actors and sort of put a stick in our eye whenever they get the chance to do so. I think in some respects, an effort to show that they're a big player, that they're a superpower. Even though, I mean, John McCain says they're a gas station parading as a country. But I think they're more than that, by the way. But I think they're a serious competitor.
They're like a super center or something?
And then, of course, you have North Korea, which is unpredictable in some respects. I don't think Kim Jong-un is crazy enough to launch an attack against the U.S. because it would be suicidal for him and his entire country. But he represents probably the most immediate military threat we'd face, and you don't quite know what'll happen there. Things could happen that would spiral out of control. And China is I guess a real uncertainty in that, I mean, they're very serious about dominating the world economically, and maybe more than economically. We talk about $1 trillion infrastructure program here. China is spending $1 trillion building infrastructure outside of China, in Africa, in Pakistan, to build better relations with these other countries, to also secure routes for raw materials, key raw materials that they believe will be essential for the coming century. I mean, they're playing the long game to be the powerful economic engine of the world. And we of course focus on what needs to be done here in America, but we also have to play recognizing that longer term, our capacity to compete and to have friends around the world is very, very important to us. So these things affect what the future looks like. And then, of course, there's technology. And technology, I mean, I'm so excited about the next 50 years. I hope I get to see all of it on this side of the dirt, and as much as possible, because these are exciting times. Moore's Law, which is, as you know, applies to computing power, which is a doubling of capacity every 18 to 24 months. Moore's Law is now affecting sensors, storage devices, computing power, healthcare. It's going to change the entire way our economy works. A book called The Rise of the Robots says that we're going to see about half of American jobs over the next couple of decades disappear, hopefully be replaced by new jobs. But these are exciting, thrilling times, and I want to see it all. And I think to those people just starting off in enterprise today, particularly those in the room that are in technologically advanced enterprises, what a fabulous time to be around. I mean, you don't have to work for your entire career in some little Carol, punching and adding machine. I mean, all that stuff is done by artificial intelligence and automated devices and robots.
It is?
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to tell Todd I need a new job.
This is a time for innovation, and in an innovative world, one of the reasons I'm so optimistic about America is not just our new tax policy and better regulatory vision that we have now, but in an innovative world where innovation drives the future, and I believe that's what we're moving into, America wins, because America is the innovator of the world. And as long as government gets out of the way and Uncle Sam doesn't come in and mess things up, America can win. And America winning is key to the preservation of liberty on this planet.
Thank you. Well, Mitt, thank you very much for coming. And I think these are really insightful lessons. Let's give a round of applause for Mitt.
All right, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Big standing ovation for Governor Romney.
Thanks, guys.
Alex Dunn.
Thank you.
What a great morning.
Thank you.
Thank you, Governor Romney. Thank you, Alex Dunn.